In the Marvel Avengers series, the big bad guy is Thanos, if you don't already know this, who is an alien being who is personally much more capable and much more powerful than your average, even superhero, Earth dweller. And he's on this mission to gather the Infinity Stones, which are these cosmic material entities that whoever controls them wields supernatural powers. And if you wield all of them together, you are essentially God. You are omnipotent. And his hope is that he can get them all together and then depopulate the world, which is a fairly, obvious scheme for someone to wield that kind of power. I mean, there's no shortage of earthbound villains who have thought that depopulation is a solution to all of our problems. Anyways, so Thanos is out there trying to find these Infinity Stones and gather them all together. And as some of Earth's heroes and otherworldly heroes interact with Thanos in this fight and the quest to try and gather these stones and protect these stones, it becomes very obvious to anybody watching the film that these powers, these stones, and the power that they inflict are quite dangerous to anybody who isn't already self-sufficient in their own right as a powerful being. And so your average human being, if they came in too close a contact with these stones, or all of them together, as they're mounted in a glove that Thanos is called the Infinity Gauntlet, then it could kill them quite easily. And that's not hard for us to imagine, this idea that there could be a force or a power or a being or an entity within the universe that is in its own right extremely powerful, but as a result extremely dangerous for us to approach. And that kind of thing isn't even really remote from our own experience. We can think of heavenly bodies like the sun, our own star in our own solar system, which, even from where we sit with an atmosphere and a finely tuned environment for us to occupy, if we don't respect the power of the sun, it can hurt us significantly. And if we had the ability to go out and if technology were of such a nature that we could actually get close to the sun, which isn't beyond the range of possibility given where technology is already, it could very easily kill us. Now, as this relates to what I want to talk about today, this is something that is depicted even for us in Scripture. For those of us of a Judeo-Christian sympathy. So in the Old Testament, Moses asks at one point if he can see God's glory, and God says to him, "If I were to do that, it would kill you." Now, think about what are we talking about here? We're talking about God. We're talking about the ground of all being. If we can imagine that there could be something like an Infinity Stone, or if we want to move away from the whole superhero genre, just some sort of a force out there like the sun, that is so powerful in its own right that we who are vulnerable and finite and limited in proximity to such a power couldn't cope with the presence of it. It could kill us. Now imagine the most powerful, something that you can't conceive of anything greater than the ground of all being, the source and creator of the entire universe. And even if you don't want to entertain the idea of a personal God, let's just say a force, the force that created and instigated the Big Bang. Imagine a force like that. Well, it would make sense that to get too close to it, without a proper appreciation, without due diligence, without proper safeguards, it would be extremely dangerous for us to do that. And God basically says that to Moses. He says, if I were to give you a fuller revelation of who and what I am, to expose you to what I am, it would kill you. And so he says, I'm going to walk by here and I'm going to hide you behind this rock and you'll get just a glimpse of me as I walk by. And even that has some pretty serious physical effects. So if you're a person of faith, if you have any appreciation for what is contained within the Bible, it shouldn't be that hard to imagine that we need to respect that kind of power. We need to respect God if we're going to approach him in any way, shape, or form. And now, if you are a Christian and if you're a Catholic, you should be able to appreciate the fact, and you should believe the fact, that God has been able to channel that essence, his substance, his divine nature, all of that power in an accessible way for us. In what we believe to be the Eucharist or Holy Communion, that all the divine nature, body, blood, soul, and divinity of the incarnate person, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, is present for us in that sacrament. It's been made available to us in such a way that God's glory won't kill us if we're exposed to it. And not only are we going to be exposed to it, but we're going to we're going to commune with it. We're going to become one. Our bodies are going to become one with the body of God in such a way that we synthesize his body. It becomes part of us and it gives us new life. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean we can be reckless with what we're doing. It doesn't mean that we can presume upon that great gift and that great power. It still means that a proper amount of preparation and caution needs to be observed in order to have access to divinity in this most profound and intimate way. And the church that God established, the church that Jesus himself established and gave authority and gave the sacraments to, has a responsibility to curate those sacraments, has a responsibility to caution those who would approach this greatest of all forces, if you want to use that kind of language, in all of reality, that those of us who would approach it need to do so in a way that respects and appreciates what it is and are properly disposed and prepared to do that. Otherwise, the consequences could be either great good for us if we are prepared, but also extremely grave for us if we're not properly disposed and prepared for it. So it makes perfect sense that the church would exercise this kind of diligence in the way that it pastors us, in the way that it leads us and guides us in our own lives. The church has been given a deposit of knowledge about what it is that most blesses us and helps us to come fully alive. And this is contained within the moral teachings of the church. This is a portrait of who and what God is. God is goodness itself. And this framework of understanding and morality is what channels all of our ability to make decisions and choices into a path that will transform us most into what God currently is, because our choices have the ability to transform us. And so whatever choices, whatever decisions, whatever actions and moral decisions we can make those that will encourage that transformation into becoming more like what we were created to be in the image of God, or they will rupture our relationship with God. And if our relationship is ruptured with God, then trying to have our own way and then the power of God and the benefit of a relationship with God seems like a pretty easy way to further inflict damage upon that relationship. And so the church cautions us about that. And of course, within these moral teachings that the church has inherited, it encourages us to follow and stay within the boundaries of those moral teachings, not just for arbitrary reasons, but for our own sake, to help us become fully what we need to become, to become fully alive, to best encourage the opportunity that we have to be fully alive and to flourish and to be blessed for it. But if we choose to stray from that path and those boundaries, then we are endangering ourselves. We are diminishing our own vitality and our own human potential. And so the church, in her care and pastoral care, because God cares about us too, and the church is responsible for exercising his will to whatever degree they have been given that authority, the church has a responsibility to encourage us back into the fold, back into the pastures that God has set as boundaries for us to live our lives. And if we refuse to do that, the church can't force us to for our own sake, but the church can discipline us. The church can impose consequences on us so as best to encourage us to say, oh yeah, this isn't a good situation I'm in. I need to come back into the pastures that are safe and good for me and best promote my human flourishing. And that brings us to recent events because, and forgive me, I'm not American, so I'm not as fluent in American politics as many of my viewers will be, but as I understand it, Nancy Pelosi, who I believe is the Speaker of the House, the lower house, the Congress in the United States, she presents herself as a Catholic worthy of participation within the life of the church and access to this great presence of divinity here on earth in Holy Communion. She believes that she should be able to define her own measures of preparation and to have access to it without any caution, without any due diligence, without adhering to what the church tells us we ought to do to be properly prepared for that. And as it turns out, she publicly confesses things that are contrary to the teachings of the church. And not just as an intellectual exercise, but as it affects her legislative performance. She is able to dictate and to promote laws and the organization of our society politically in such a way that creates severe injustices for the most vulnerable among us, which are the unborn. She's a fanatical proponent of abortion. but still insists that she is Catholic, faithfully Catholic, supposedly, is my understanding of what she seems to believe about herself, and that she can maintain and promote things that are completely contrary to the church's own teachings. And as a result, her bishop has responsibly stepped in and said, you're no longer able to present yourself for communion. And that is perfectly within his right. As I've described already, the church has a responsibility, if they purport to be those who care for the flock and the sheep of the flock, they have a severe responsibility to ensure that we don't hurt ourselves in our interactions with God, who is this incredible source of either life or consequence and judgment for us. And Scripture itself even records this fact. St. Paul says, those who do not discern the body before they take and eat of it will eat and drink judgment unto themselves. So the consequences are quite severe, and any bishop who cares at all for the people that he is supposed to be a spiritual father for would have to intervene with somebody who refuses to follow the teachings of the church, yet still believes that they should have access to something that could hurt them. And sadly, a lot of the usual suspects have come out condemning the bishop for doing this, accusing him of politicizing the sacraments and politicizing Holy Communion. And there have been a few objections that have been made that I wanted to respond to really quick, because this is in the news. The first is this idea that he's politicized the Eucharist. Well, the problem with this is that the church has taught what it teaches going back to the ancient world, long before anything like the United States has ever existed, and has always consistently taught that abortion is a moral evil and an injustice and is the killing of an innocent life. So when suddenly the United States of America, some 2,000 years later, decides that it's going to amend its laws such that it's going to allow this to go on, well, the church shouldn't at that point say, oh, now this has become a political issue and we don't want to get involved in politics, so we're gonna stop promoting this teaching that we've always promoted for fear of being accused of politicizing something. In fact, the exact opposite is what's going on here. The state has politicized something that the church already taught. And if you're somebody who believes in the separation of church and state and freedom of religion, well, then you should be convinced that the church should have full rights and authority to maintain its own sphere of influence and to teach the things that it's going to teach, whether or not the state decides to make decisions about it or not. So the Supreme Court made this decision in Roe v. Wade, and now politicians are taking stances on it and advocating a particular position on it. But if the church was to ignore the things that politicians are saying about an ancient teaching of the church, that would be politicizing it. Saying that politicians should be immune from consequences for disobeying and contradicting, publicly promoting contrary ideas to the teachings of the church, would be to say, that would be to politicize this particular teaching. It would be to say that politicians should be immune from those consequences, whereas everybody else, because they're not politicians, they should still be bound to the teachings of the church. Well, that is the very definition of politicizing something. If the bishop here had refrained from doing that, he again would be making exceptions and upholding a double standard for a politician, which would be to politicize the church's teachings. Something else I saw somebody say about this was that this is going to accomplish nothing. If this was purely about scoring political points, maybe that's true. I'm not even convinced that that's necessarily true. But that's not what this is about. The church isn't trying to, and in this case, Archbishop Cordeleone, who's the Archbishop of San Francisco, isn't trying to score points necessarily. The thing that is going to be accomplished here, this person claimed it's going to accomplish nothing, but it actually is going to accomplish something, which is it's going to prevent Nancy Pelosi from profaning divinity here on earth, from endangering her soul. If you want to go back to the analogy of the infinity stones, from getting too close to the sun or getting too close to these infinity stones without realizing the power that she's interacting with. And since the Archbishop is responsible for that power and the consequences that could arise from people coming into proximity without being prepared, he has a responsibility to prevent that from happening if we aren't going to be careful ourselves as we approach the Blessed Sacrament. So frankly, yes, something is it is going to result in preventing this from happening and potentially preserving Nancy Pelosi from further endangering herself. And for somebody to say that this isn't going to accomplish anything, it just goes to show that what that person is concerned with is merely politics and no concern whatsoever for the soul or health or safety or vitality of Nancy Pelosi. So clearly the only person in this dynamic that does care about the person of Miss Pelosi is the Archbishop, and not these people who are confessing mere loyalty to a political party and a political doctrine and political objectives. These are the people who are politicizing this particular issue, not the Archbishop and not those who encourage the Archbishop. Now, the media has, of course, piled on to the Archbishop and many supposedly faithful Catholics likewise in defense of Ms. Pelosi. To that, I would say that anybody who sympathizes with what I've said here so far should be sure to voice their support for the Archbishop at this time. It's not easy to be a faithful Archbishop, just as it wasn't easy for Jesus to teach the kinds of things that he had to teach, which were controversial among his hearers. So to whatever degree we can, especially if you're within the Diocese of San Francisco, offer your support to this very courageous bishop. And the more we do so, maybe it will encourage other bishops who are a little still reluctant to exercise this kind of responsibility, which they are tasked with, whether they like it or not, to do what they ought to be doing in these circumstances. So thank you, Archbishop Cordeleone, and thank you to all those who have supported him and all the bishops who exercise this kind of courageous authority responsibly.